Hello and welcome to Migrating Your File Server to SharePoint, what to consider before making the move. My name is Nathan Austin. I'll be your presenter today, and joining me behind the scenes is Stephanie Kingsley, both of Mytech Partners. And before we get going today, I always like to a couple housekeeping items regarding the Q&A. We are going to do about 30 minutes of content today and then open it up for questions afterwards. But by all means, throughout the session today, if you wouldn't mind, if there's any questions that pop up throughout the session, go ahead and note them in the Q&A panel. Stephanie might be able to answer them offline, but even if she is, we might even add them to the end of the session after the 30-minute mark. Okay, so let's dig in. So file server to SharePoint, know before you go. Really today, it's going to help you plan for file server to SharePoint migration. It's going to give you some key variables to think about, and there's going to be a couple different components. It's not necessarily going to give you the plan because there's really a lot to think about if you want to make this plan effective and to really take advantage of and leverage the capabilities of SharePoint versus your file server. So we're going to talk about that. Again, it's not going to give you every answer to every question you might have. However, it's going to really focus on the key differences between how SharePoint is different than your file server experience. And then we're also going to talk about, we're specifically going to talk about SharePoint. And then we're going to layer on, well, what do you need to think about with Teams and how it's combined with SharePoint? Because while SharePoint is the core, the integration with Teams adds some specific additional functionality that might make you think through how to do this file server to SharePoint migration differently. Then we're going to demonstrate all these different capabilities. So we're going to hit on some of these key different variables, try and give you some visuals to what they look like to help you think through what these challenges, or not what the challenges are, but what these capabilities are as far as how it might apply and be best suited for your organization. Finally, open it up for Q&A and some next steps. So the session is being recorded, so I'm going to try not to go too fast, but we do have a lot of content to cover today. And so if there's something that I went too quickly on, we recommend please revisiting the recording, and you can stop and pause and review at your leisure. All right, before we move on, just 1 minute about Mytech. We are a small and medium business IT and computer consulting services organization. We like to work with organizations. We work with organizations who are headquartered in our geographies. And over the last 20 years of being in business, we have found that our clients typically come to us because they want a strategy, they want proven results, they just want their systems to work, and they want their team to be more productive. And so we have a proven IT strategy that helps do that, and ultimately helps remove IT challenges. Not all the challenges. IT is not perfect, and we're not perfect, but it definitely helps remove challenges, IT challenges in particular, so you can focus on serving your customers better and be more adaptable to the different business challenges that we all struggle with or all challenged with over time. Ultimately, when we partner with and work together with our clients, we know our clients can achieve 4 times more value and productivity from their IT investments. If that's something you'd like to learn a little bit more about or like to talk to us about, by all means, raise your hand. We'd love to have a conversation. But that's not why you're here today, so we're going to move on to the content. But again, thank you for letting me indulge us in 1 minute about Mytech. Okay, file server versus SharePoint. Let's do a compare and contrast. Well, at its foundation, SharePoint could be used nearly identically to your file server. Again, at its foundation. Now, there's some technical folks that might take aversion to what I just said. However, at its foundation, it could be as simple as copying and pasting what you're doing in your file server. We don't recommend that, which is exactly why we're doing this session. But we're going to talk about the difference between SharePoint sites versus network drives. There are some comparisons there that might help you think through this. We're going to talk about document libraries and some of the metadata that you can apply versus folders and subfolders that exist in your file server. And again, I'm trying to do a direct comparison and contrast to SharePoint here. SharePoint views and how you can differ that versus what's capable in your file server, because you really can't customize those views in your file in your file explorer and your file server. There's also capabilities for alerts, notifications, and workflow. We're not going to go deep into that. We're merely going to touch on some of the alert capabilities and notification capabilities so that it can give you an idea of how you can use SharePoint differently, if that's applicable to you. And finally, there are some things that SharePoint is not a great fit for. And like, for instance, one of the examples I like to use is that QuickBooks or oftentimes accounting programs and other programs that work like those kind of programs. If they're a database-oriented program that's currently stored on your file server today and your application accesses it, SharePoint's probably not the right answer for you. So we're not saying that everything on your file server can necessarily go to SharePoint. So there are some gotchas, but that's just one of the public service announcements we always like to make sure that you're evaluating all the different files and types of files and applications that might be accessing and leveraging your file server before you just completely make the switch. So that's really the primary compare and contrast between SharePoint and your file server. But I also wanted to talk about, well, what if you layer on Teams with SharePoint? So for instance, there are differences between Teams SharePoint sites versus non-Teams sites, and that is a SharePoint site as well. Basically, whenever you have a team, there is a correlated and associated SharePoint site, but you can also have a site that is not associated with the team. So there are some differences there. One of the things I really like about Teams as compared to how your file server really works, but when you combine that with SharePoint, is that how it gives you a lot of flexibility to support the different complexity aspects of your organization, or the unique aspects of your organization. If you have cross-functional groups, if you have tiered of teams like a corporate and a branch, or different branches or different sites, but yet you have different sites, but they need to share some same information. So there's different ways in which Teams and SharePoint together really help you make it easier and fewer clicks and faster to access information for those in those types of situations. One of the things I love about layering in Teams with SharePoint, again, that's might help you think through how you might choose to structure your environment before a migration, is how you can layer in Teams collaboration with documents and communication versus emailing documents around. That's a soapbox that I won't go too deep into, but we will touch on that today. One of the things I also like about Teams and SharePoint together is that Teams provides a decentralized versus centralized management. So one of the things you're going to want to think through relative to making this change is that there's another layer of permissioning that is nice because it provides maybe your department heads or team leads the opportunity to execute without having to go to your internal IT staff or a company like Mytech. But there's also some gotchas there too, so you want to be aware of that. And then the last one is linked document libraries for faster access to files. This is an example of how you can use that flexibility of Teams and SharePoint together to be able to make it easier for your team, depending on where they are, to access information that they need to do their role and fulfill their job. All right, so those are the high-level items that we're going to cover in the demonstration, but these are the key differences that I feel hopefully will help you think through what it looks like to go between from a file server environment to your Teams and SharePoint environment. All right, so let's dig in to the demonstration. I'm going to start by pulling over our demo environment here. So this is, I'm logged into one of the places where I started is office.com, and I just clicked on the SharePoint icon here, and that basically took me to the kind of core part of SharePoint. So one of the things that I like to, at a high level, offer a comparison to, and here I'm going to go down to like, so this is like, for instance, network drives. I'm going to purposely put this kind of off the side of the screen, is network drives. So you think about, you know, you have a company, maybe different groups and subfolders, sales, marketing, leadership, you know, et cetera. And then, but if you compare that to SharePoint, you have some of those similar ones, you know, the all company operations, sales, marketing, cross-functional, maybe internal IT, et cetera. So there's different, these are similar to what you're used to in your existing file server structure when you look at the way SharePoint sites work. Now, however, that's probably where the similarities completely depart from each other. So again, like that's why I made a comment, as at its foundation, SharePoint sites and mapped network drives that I was illustrating here are similar in that they are organizing the data by kind of permissioning group and who needs access to this information. You're doing the same thing here with the different sites, and all of these sites are connected to Teams, but we'll talk about that more later. But at its foundation, that's what I wanted to just kind of make that correlation to help you think through it. But again, that's where it really starts to diverge. All right, so now if you think about files in sites, so I'm going to go to, I just picked on the marketing team here, and I clicked on the documents tab. So every SharePoint Teams SharePoint site has a documents tab. It's called a document library. And there are some existing documents we have in here. So one of the things that I like to illustrate is that different document libraries have not only the same thing that you're probably used to, like these 3 columns here, probably similar to what you're used to in your file serving, is that you have potentially files and folders. You might have the last modified date and maybe who it was modified by, but that's about what all you have. Now notice there are different columns over here, and one of the things that I like to talk about with regard to how these columns work is that this might be where you, instead of having folders and a bunch of subfolders, there might be some subfolders as illustrated here, but you might be able to use these columns to allow sorting and filtering of information faster. One of the things I like to highlight when you talk about document libraries is that these columns, and I'm going to click into one of these folders to illustrate it, these columns are established at the document library level. What I mean by that is when I click into this folder, you're going to see those columns stay. So I'm going to click into that really quick, and notice those columns exist. I don't have any data here, but the columns are still there. I can click back to documents. I can click on one of these other folders. The columns are still there. So that's one of the things I like to illustrate, because it may be that you, at a site level, you have multiple document libraries because you might want to have different columns to help you sort and filter and enable searching of your content. So that's why, as illustration, there's another document library here that we've created for demonstration purposes, like an HR document library. So I'm going to click on that, and notice the columns are different. I just have a document type, and I could add another column if I wanted to and customize that column for this document library. But the point is that columns and some of the metadata that you can use to sort and filter and categorize your data is basically defined at a document library level, not at the site level. Again, so thinking about if you have a map network drive, you might have different levels of documents that you want. So say subfolders in those, and those might be similar to the document library. So you might have document libraries that are part of your, if your network drive, for example, so that you can organize your information this way. So one of the reasons why I wanted to highlight the columns is because this is one of the key capabilities that I love about SharePoint that's really powerful for your team. So notice we have all these columns and we've categorized a bunch of documents down here. So if I come up here, there's this little filter icon that looks like a funnel. So if I click on this, it gives me the opportunity to filter my view based on the different criteria that exist in this document library. So for instance, let's say I wanted to apply the filter for everything that's been categorized as orange. And what I also like about this, if you might note, that you can apply multiple categories to a different document. So this document, by illustration, has the blue, orange, red, and yellow tag, where this one only has the orange tag. So one of the things that you could not do in a file server is if I had an orange subfolder and a blue subfolder, I might have this document in both. And because which one do you put it in when it actually applies to both categories? So this is where a SharePoint document library and this metadata can allow you to store your information a lot better and easier than necessarily having a bunch of subfolders. Okay, so I can click the orange filter, and now I'm only going to look at the orange data. So I'm going to go ahead and click that to close it. One of the things I also can do, now that I've actually filtered my data by anything that meets my criteria or the filter that I've applied, I can actually come in here. And notice I'm going to save this view as the orange view, right? So I'm going to click that, hit save. So now I've created a view that is the orange view. I've also created another view that is a combination of Minneapolis, notice here, and orange. So I'm going to click on that, and notice this document should go away and these ones should remain by clicking on this view. There we go. So now the only documents that I see are those that meet both criteria of orange and Minneapolis in our session, in our content here. What I also like is, for instance, if this is these were the types of documents that I need to do my job and fulfill my role, I can actually set this view as my default view. So instead of having to come in here and every time have to click on this filter setting, choose the filters that I want, and doing that, I can set this as my default view. So anytime I go to this page, this is the view that I get. Now, of course, it's really easy. All I got to do is click on this drop down. If I want to look at all the documents or other filter categories that I've defined, I can choose to do that. So I'll pull it back to all documents for illustration. And so it doesn't mess me up in the future because I've had that happen. I'm going to set this view as default because this is the view that I want. Okay, so that's an example of where you can use the different metadata to avoid having folders and subfolders, but also allowing your data to be more dynamic and apply to multiple different types of criteria and allow your team to sort and filter and find that information a lot faster and easier. Okay, now I want to talk about alerts. So if you come up here on the breadcrumbs, if you can see my mouse up here, one of the things that you can do that I really like about SharePoint is, let's say if you're the manager, the department head, or you're responsible for this document library, and you want to know if things change. So you can come up here and click Alert, which you can't do this in file servers. At least I don't think you can, or at least not very easily if you can do it. And forgive me, I'm not the most technical person, so if there's a way to do it, be curious to see if someone posts that, but I don't believe you can. But anyway, if you're for instance, if as a business case, if you're the owner of this document library, the person responsible for the content of this library, you might want to get notified by email or SMS if anything changes or if new items are added. What about existing items are modified, or if something gets deleted on accident? You might want to know that. For instance, and you can send these alerts when any of these things change. You can also choose to have an immediate notification, a daily, or a weekly summary. So this is an area where you can manage your alerts and notifications if there's content here that you want to make sure that you get notified of if there's a change and what frequency you'd like to get notified. So I like that capability that's unique to SharePoint, and not everyone necessarily might use that. However, for those of you, especially if you're responsible for it, or for instance, if you have a SharePoint site that manages all of your document templates, for instance, you might want to be able to you might want to receive a notification if one of the templates gets updated or changed, because then you can know that, hey, there's a new template here. I need to make sure I'm using that. So those are examples of how you can use notifications in your organization, different from how a file server operates. Again, lastly, relative to SharePoint, I also want to, again, mention that public service announcement that not all applications like QuickBooks or financial applications work with SharePoint and OneDrive like they do with your file server. So please be aware to look at your applications and understand those limitations or requirements before you presume that you can move everything from your file server to SharePoint. All right, so now what I'd like to do is let's move over to looking at Teams. So I'm going to pull up Teams, and I want to actually go to the, I want to talk about the Teams sites, which is everything that I was just showing. In fact, I'll go back to that really quick, forgive me. I'll go back to here. So these are all Teams sites. And one of the things, when you create a site, I'll illustrate that. If you click up here to say create site, if you can see my mouse up here, one of the options it'll give you is, do you want a Teams site, which is associated with Teams, or a communication site, which is a non-Team site or just a SharePoint site that's designed for communications. So by illustration, I created a communication site. I want to, yes, I want to cancel. So I created and named it appropriately, hopefully, a non-Team SharePoint site or a communication site. And I wanted to illustrate that this is a common use that we see for instance, a document template site. Where maybe everybody in your organization uses it, because you can actually apply different levels of permissions more granularly. And this is probably more comparable to what you can do in your file server, how you can have permissions stacked throughout the file structure. We recommend don't get that too complicated because it can get a little messy. But if you think through it, having a non-Teams communication site might make sense in certain scenarios. Again, we can help you with some of those scenarios and help you think through that. But I wanted to at least at a high level articulate that there is such a thing as a non-Team site and a Team site, where by default, when you go into SharePoint, this is what you see, these are all Team sites by default. And I actually had to link, so any of the recent, or when I click on, if I click see all sites, all of these sites are all Team sites. Notice my non-Team SharePoint site doesn't even show up here. So I actually had to create a link. So I I created a link that is linking to the non-team site up here. So that's an example of how team sites versus non-team sites work. Very, very, very high level, but I just wanted at a high level kind of articulate that. So now one of the things I'd like to illustrate with Teams is I'd like to go to the marketing team, and I'm going to go into so this is where you can communicate and collaborate with conversation threads. I'm not going to get into the details there, but what I'm going to illustrate is a way in which Teams and SharePoint working together provide an experience that just is completely different than a file server and sending, say, emails. So I'm going to go into the file section. I actually created a new document in preparation for this that I just called, in fact, actually, shoot, I did it in the operations team, I believe. Sorry about that. I created a new document. Again, notice my default view up here. I want to go to all documents. That's my default view coming through, and even in Teams, I created this new document called Draft Collaboration. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on little breadcrumbs. Notice you have to hover over it to see the breadcrumbs, and I'm going to hit Copy Link. So I've already uploaded this document, and I like to use, when I do this, by the way, I like to use the SharePoint link. That way it actually opens the document in SharePoint versus in Teams. Because I'd rather it open up another browser window. That's just personal preference. You can do either way, whichever one suits you. But now I'm going to come in here and say, for instance, let's say I want to have a new conversation, and I'll say, please help with review draft document. So with Teams, what I like to be able to do is you can consolidate your communication and collaboration into a conversation here. I'll say team. Or I could say at Stephanie. So Stephanie is an example. I've got her in there. So I can tag Stephanie or anybody else. So I can just say team, or I can specifically tag someone. Please help me review and provide feedback on this draft document. Thanks. All right, so what I can do then, I'll say provide feedback on this draft document. Then I can click this little icon right here, which allows me to insert a link. And I'm going to paste that link in here. And now when I click send, that posts this document. It provides a link specifically to that document. And then if I want to, I can click on this document and it will pull up this document in a browser window, as I illustrated, and this is where Stephanie could come in here, or anyone on the team could come in here and start collaborating on that. So additionally, with that collaboration, you could also then say Stephanie could come in here and write, and she might be doing this as we speak, or she might not, I'm not sure, but she could also put here like at Nate. It's probably not allowing me to at tag myself, but she could say reviewed the document, made comments, something like that, or make the comments in the document themselves. But this is a way we're actually tying the document repository of the operations team and the document library of the operations team with how your team actually interacts and collaborates on that document, versus how many times have you sent an email that has a document attached and then people are editing that document, and again, you see an example, Stephanie tagged me and then said, got it, thanks, we'll make notes soon. So you might have sent those documents back and forth. So this is an example of where Teams adds a layer of communication and collaboration onto leveraging and using and collaborating on your files that the file server doesn't really provide. So that's one of the things I love about how Teams can help with that. So now I want to touch on, again, it's not that this is a total revelation, especially if you're used to Teams. However, this is something that it's something you can think through as far as how you might structure your Teams environment, because your documents that you have in your file server, there might be different ways in which your team is responsible for collaborating with those documents, which might influence the team structure that you choose to establish and the associated SharePoint structure, if that makes sense. All right, so one of the other things I like to highlight about Teams is the decentralized management, and I'll give you an illustration of that. At the parent level, if you will, or at the top level, there's the global administrator, which is typically folks like our engineering team or your internal IT team. But if you click on this little breadcrumb right here, you can click on Manage Team. And if you are there's a concept of an owner of a team. If you're an owner of a team, you will see yourself up here, and you'll also have the settings tab. If you are not an owner of the team, you will not see this settings tab. The reason why I like to call this out as a public service announcement is because the owner of the team also gets to choose what permissions the team members can do. So, for instance, create and update channels, create private channels, delete and restore channels. There might be some things that you do not want members of your team to be able to do. And so at a global level, you can set some of these settings, but once you've assigned an owner to that team, those owners then can manage these settings, can manage the membership of the team, can manage the folder, the sub-channel structure of the team, etc. So it's important that I really appreciate that flexibility. There also comes risk with that because you could create structure that without thinking through it. But that's one of the things I do like about the decentralized capability of Teams is it really puts a lot of authority and a capability into the hands of your team versus having to run the IT anytime you want to make a change. All right, so one of the other things I wanted to illustrate is, for instance, some of the flexibility. So for instance, let's say this is the corporate operations team or Site A's operation team, but then you might have a branch operation team or a different geographies operation team. Well, but this team needs the same documents that this team does. So why don't we try and figure out how, instead of like copying documents or having, again, this is, if you think about your file structure, you might have a corporate operations team and a branch operations team, and you could, I guess you could put a shortcut in there, but effectively, how do you do that in Teams and SharePoint? So there is a Files tab up here, and there is a function where you can link what they call it, you can add cloud storage. So I just went, again, I'm in the branch operations team. Let's say this is another site, but basically the branch operations team and the main operations team need to collaborate and use the same information. So I'm going to hit add a cloud storage. I'm going to click SharePoint. And it's going to give me some relevant sites that are potentially available. And notice the operations team is already here. So I'm going to click on operations team, hit next. And now it's going to pull up any document library that exists in the operations team. So let's say they need to collaborate on vendor management. So I'll just select that document library and click next, and I'll say add folder. So now what happens is that the operations team vendor management folder is now document library that's connected to SharePoint is now linked to my branch operations team. So instead of my branch operations team having to navigate out of their team site where they're communicating and collaborating on a daily basis, into the operations team or out into, say, SharePoint in order to try and find that information, they can just stay right inside of their team's environment, and now they have fewer clicks. They might be collaborating here, and they have one click to get to their documents as well as linked other document libraries that they may need to use. So that's an example of where it gives you some additional flexibility to be able to link information that different team members might be able to use, and it gives them faster access. The other illustration that I'm going to use is, for instance, in the marketing team. Let's say I'm in the marketing team, and now I want to take the non-Teams SharePoint site that's a document repository or a template, and how do I then link that back to, say, the marketing team, so the marketing team doesn't have to go into SharePoint to find that document library. So I'm going to come into Files again, and I'm going to click Add Cloud Storage from SharePoint. And notice it's not showing up here because this is pulling up my Teams sites. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose Use a SharePoint link. So I'm going to click that, and it's asking me for the library URL. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to navigate out to the non-Teams SharePoint site that I have pulled up here. I'm going to pull up the company templates document library because these are the templates that I want to provide so that my team has easy access to them and fewer clicks to access them. And I'm just going to come up here to the URL bar, and I'm going to hit copy. And then I'm going to go back into Teams, and I'm just going to hit paste, Control V. So there we go, hit go. It recognizes it as the non-Team SharePoint site. I'll click next. I think it will actually ask me to confirm this is I want the company templates. Click next, add folder. So now my marketing team, they're already used to living and existing here for all the information they need. Now, instead of having to navigate outside of their existing team, they can just come to where they're already used to going and access the non-Team SharePoint site company templates document library. So I feel like this is an example, again, of the different flexibility. And one of the common problems that we see across clients and prospects that we work with on Microsoft and SharePoint is document templates and how people have copies of document templates all over their organization, saved to their desktop in different subfolders and folders. And this is one of the ways in which you can really consolidate that and take that opportunity when you move to SharePoint. I know I'm running long and I'm almost done. The last thing that I would suggest relative to this is that if you're thinking about or walking through this process, a little tip might be to create a test environment. So this is a complete demo environment. So that's something that, because if we do this would kind of work, it made sense for us to do that. But this is your team environment, your team's environment. What I might recommend is just create a test team and create a test non-SharePoint, non-team SharePoint site, and work through different scenarios and try and test these different scenarios so that you might be able to see how it works as you think through and try and process it. So that is really the last tip that I wanted to mention, is just potentially making a test team and or a test non-team SharePoint site so you could see how these different capabilities work together and interact in an effort to help your planning. So, all right, I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint here. So here's a summary. If there's, some people, if they was presenting to you in live and this was on a background, this is where people might be taking pictures. But really trying some of the steps: core structure, understanding how your existing files and data might map to SharePoint sites or team sites. What substructure might you need? That might mean different document libraries. It might mean different subfolders, or it might mean those different metadata columns that we described that help your team access that information faster and easier. 3, if you do have time, again, one of the things a common conversation we have with folks is saying that, okay, my file server, the physical server itself, is end of life at the end of 2021. So I want to reverse engineer from 2021 when I want to get rid of that thing and I don't want to have to buy another one to now. And how can we work through a pilot engagement to get your team used to and ready and thinking through it? Because it's not as simple as just a copy and paste. It could be as simple as that, but again, with all the differences that we illustrated today, we're not recommending a simple copy and paste. But here's some ways in which you could go through it. One of the things I illustrated is creating a test team site and SharePoint site, build the structure. You also might consider, which I didn't mention previously, what we might call an archive site. So if you're it's just really maybe creating a non-team SharePoint site that's called archive, for example. There's nothing fancy to it other than you move data that you don't think you need or want in your core SharePoint environment and Teams environment, but what if you do need it? So a way to do that, if you parse through it and you're like, I don't think we need this data, I'm going to move it anyway just in case, but you limit access to that archive site to a few people, and that if you need the information or need access to it, those people can then pull that data from the archive site and put it into the regular environment, and now it's in your production environment. It's just a way of potentially not copying over mess or old stuff that you really don't want and you're hoping you don't need, but you're not sure. So that's just a little tip or trick that I'd recommend. And then finally, sorry, hit my scroll bar on my mouse. You might not be able to do step 3, but if you move straight to step 4 or from step 3 or from step 2, build a structure. I do recommend training your team. I do recommend helping your team understand how to use OneDrive, which we didn't talk about today, but that's a key component to help migration and help the utilization from your team, and some of the default views, some of those filters that might be applicable to your team. If you help your team with that, it'll dramatically increase their adoption, their ability to use these tools right away. Reinforcing in meetings, again, follow-up training and elicit feedback where you might want to fill the gaps. Those are some key steps for a successful file server to SharePoint and Teams migration. Okay, recommended action items. As I mentioned, when might be the potential right time for this to happen for you, right? Because every organization's on a different timeline. You might have criteria or catalysts to say, look, we've got everyone working remotely and I'm tired of VPN connection, so let's get this going. You might have a file server that's end of life at the end of this year, as I illustrated, and let's try and time it to that. Whatever those potential catalysts for you are, try and identify those. It might make sense for you to reverse engineer a timeline. So, and then please write down some key takeaways today. Like, what are those top 5 things that really made sense that you want to really process through? And one of those might be just, hey, when you're ready to do this, remember this link, this video, so you can go back and refresh it. Or it might mean that, hey, raise a hand if you'd like some help with this, because this is really complex. There's a lot to it, and we love helping people walk through this and think through this stuff so that you can start using this Teams and SharePoint better than if you didn't go through this process or think through some of these different variables. Finally, join us for our future virtual training sessions. We're doing them every other week, and then every other month, we're doing our power user group sessions. We just finished one at the end of February. Our next one is the end of April, and we'd love to have power users participate in those. And those are a little bit longer, a little bit more technical, but those power users in your organization are really the ones that we're targeting to get to those, so they can help you and your organization navigate some of these complexities and adapt over time, because this isn't a one-time thing. These things will change, your organization will change, and those power users are the ones you might want to designate to help you through those changes. Okay, with that said, thank you so much for attending. I know I ran a few minutes long. I really appreciate your time, and hopefully this was helpful to get you start thinking about the differences. And for those of you who have to drop off, thank you so much, and stay tuned for a link to the recording afterwards. But for those of you who can stick around, let's open it up for questions to see if we can clarify any details that I probably rushed over through the session. So Stephanie, let's open it up for questions.
Thanks, Nate. And you kind of touched on this one at the end and a little bit throughout the session, but to attack it a little more directly, we had someone ask, is SharePoint the same as OneDrive? Great question. No, it is not. So I'll illustrate that in a couple of different ways. So let me pull up the SharePoint, SharePoint site, and I'm actually going to use this one as an example, but I'm also going to pull up my file explorer. I don't want it that big. Here we go. So I'm going to pull up my file explorer, and I'll give you an example. So here, contoso. This is the demo environment that we're in. This doesn't say contoso over here at all, but contoso is the dummy company or demo company that Microsoft creates when we establish these sessions. So contoso is the company, and this is basically OneDrive synchronizing these different file structures. So if you look at this, I'm actually going to click back to SharePoint, and then I'm going to have to click on this again. So you notice the all MTP 365 general, it's associated with this. The board of directors, forgive me, I've got to move this so you can see some of that, but the board of directors group, that's syncing from this site here, guest access team, marketing team, it's syncing from this team, for instance. So this is basically syncing. This is OneDrive, which is basically accessible via my file explorer on my local machine. And OneDrive is a device-by-device setting. If I choose to synchronize these documents on my laptop, or I can also sync them to my mobile, I can choose different files and folders to sync to different devices. Okay, so and I'll illustrate this because I don't have the NonTeams SharePoint site. So what I'm going to do is click on this, the NonTeams SharePoint site. I want to sync the company templates document repository. This is a common problem, and this is a great illustration of your question and a common problem that we see across our clients, including us, by the way. We're human beings just like everybody, and we have similar challenges. So if you want to enable your team to have very quick and fast access to the document templates, these are the production, formal, authorized templates that you want your team to use whenever they're onboarding someone, or whenever they're, again, I just put some generic names like an internal reference template or internal team guide. But let's say anytime they onboard someone, this is the template you want them to use. Okay, well, what if they don't like or they're not as comfortable going to SharePoint? Well, one of the ways you can help them is you just click this little sync button. But before I do, what you're going to see happen, and it's going to be nearly instantaneous, so I want to call it out, is that once I click sync, presuming, of course, a demo, maybe it's going to break, but once I click sync, what should happen is that I should see another folder here that's going to be called NonTeam SharePoint Site - Company Templates. Okay, and that will pop up in here. So I'm going to come back over here and I'm going to click sync. And this is going to sync the information that's in SharePoint to my local device via OneDrive. And notice it's saying we are connecting to OneDrive so your device can sync. And it's going to say, hey, do you want to do this? And I want to say yes. All right. So now I'm just going to come over here. There, it did its thing. And I'm going to click on my file explorer. And guess what? Now I have the NonTeam SharePoint Site Company Templates folder that wasn't there a few seconds ago, that if I click into here, you'll see those are the same 3 documents that exist now accessible on my local machine, not unlike as if I'm accessing SharePoint. So I didn't spend time on that today very intentionally because I was already ran over time, but this is another way where you can really help your team if they're trying to drive adoption, or you get those folks that are, gosh, I don't know if I want to use and access a web browser to access files. Well, all you have to do, if this is an example of something like just document templates that you want to get your team to use consistently and that you want to have them sync it via OneDrive, just you can go to their machine, literally look over their shoulder, click that sync button, and it'll sync, and their machine and the SharePoint site will stay in sync all the time. And you can also even come up here if you really wanted to and say, hey, let's manage their notifications, and you could set their notifications to say, hey, send alerts when any existing items are modified. Great, thanks. And so now, not only are they going to sync to the local machine, but you set an alert to them anytime one of the document templates changes that they're going to receive, so they know that there's a new template available if they need it. So hopefully that answers the question. Again, I didn't go that into the session, but great question. And thank you, because it really allowed me to illustrate another point that I think is a very common problem that, and I'm not kidding, every single organization I've talked to in these engagements has this problem. And it's a challenge to solve.
We have another question here. They're asking, do you find moving public folder calendars to SharePoint/Teams to be a feasible option, or should they be kept in Outlook? We noticed that the granularity of permissions and functionality is either too complicated or non-existent in SharePoint and Teams. Yeah,
I don't have a great way to illustrate the answer to that question, but I would agree with you in general. If you have historically been using what is public folders in Exchange, moving those to Teams and SharePoint, there's not great calendar functionality there. There just isn't. Rumor has it that on the roadmap there is a plan to be able to integrate a SharePoint calendar, like similar to, again, I don't know all the functions, the purpose of using your public folder calendar, but from what I've read, there's a roadmap to be able to sync the SharePoint calendar with Outlook. But yes, I would say for now, if that's a function where you're trying to really use it as a room reservation or an equipment reservation or a PTO count, I mean, it's going to be a much better experience today in Outlook than it is in Teams and SharePoint. Yeah, short answer to that.
Thanks, Nate. Got another one here. They're stating that they're wanting to migrate to SharePoint for their file server, but they do not use Microsoft Teams, maybe in the future. For a transition, they're thinking of migrating files and folders to SharePoint with each department folder in a site, training staff to use OneDrive, so it's similar to what they've used before, and over time they can introduce the intranet web interface and Microsoft Teams. Thoughts?
I love this question and great idea. That's actually one of the reasons why the last time we did this session, I really commingled the SharePoint and Teams versus the file server. And as I was thinking through it this time, relative to other conversations I've had with organizations, not exactly along these lines, but there is differences between SharePoint and file server versus Teams and SharePoint and your file server. So yes, I would recommend pretty much, I think, exactly what you're suggesting, because what you can do, and I probably am not going to do this justice, but you can create these sites, and I would recommend creating them similar to how we just described, where if you have like a network drive or a map network drive or folder, that could be a separate site, because what you could start with is a communication site, and there is a way to connect it to Teams in the future. And I think I might even be able to illustrate this, because what I have found is sometimes when you don't connect it to a team, it actually says, hey, do you want to connect this to a team? It almost asks you or prompts you from time to time. It's not giving me that right now, but yes. So in order for you to align that, if you think through how you might use Teams, again, you can always adjust too, so you don't have to like get paralyzed with analysis. But if you think through how you might use Teams, or the different sites like this, and that these might become Teams in the future, or you might connect these to Teams, and the permissioning, that would work great, and that'll make it much easier for you to attach Teams at a future date. Now, the one thing that I will say that's a little bit of an asterisk public service announcement on that is that when for a Teams SharePoint site, there isn't really granular permissions. What I mean by that is if you are a member of the all MTP 365 team or the operations team, et cetera, you have read-write access to that site. It just is. That's just the way Teams and SharePoint work together, which is one of the reasons why you might choose to have non-Teams SharePoint sites, because I could potentially permission the company templates document library to read-only access versus read-write access. You can't do that in a Teams site. At least that's what I understand. Again, Microsoft changes stuff all the time, but from what I understand from a permissioning level, that's one of the differences between why you might have a non-Team SharePoint site, because you can do a little bit more granular permissions like you're used to in some of your files in your file server than a Teams SharePoint site. So if you think about that, there might be sites that you create that are communication sites that you never intend on attaching to a team, I guess is the reason why I brought that up. And there may be sites that you create that you intend to attach to a team. And for the sites that you intend to attach to a team, don't apply granular permissioning to the folder structure, because I think that might break, or there might be great complications when you try and attach it to teams. So that was why I wanted to illustrate that point. Hopefully that made sense.
Awesome.
I love that question.
Yeah. One more here, unless anybody else has any others they're going to post, is how do you keep sites clean with Microsoft Teams and Office 365 groups?
Yeah, so excellent question. So the answer to that question is one of the reasons why we, and I say we, I mean Mytech, and we're not alone in this, but this is a specific kind of philosophy that we try and coach and talk to our clients about, is that we do not recommend, and this goes back to what I was talking about, the granular permissioning. So for instance, if you don't lock it down, anyone in your organization could come down here and create a team. I'm going to call it private. I'm going to create a private team. I'm going to call it Nate's team. Okay, well, how do you know if that's a team that you want in your organization? Because now you're creating a SharePoint site, you're creating an organizational group, you're creating, all these other things. And so I'm going to skip that. So now I have a new team that's called Nate's team. And if you are not a member of that team, or Nate, in this example, if I didn't invite you to it, you have no idea it even exists. So what we strongly recommend, and this is why we're doing those power user groups, is because that you designate a subset of people in your organization that have the, again, this is a designation that we've kind of created, and we actually have defined internally a permissioning structure that we can apply to someone that you designate as a power user. Could be yourself, it could be, again, a subset of folks, that then opens up the ability for them to create a team. So that way you're not having just anyone in the organization, because by default, Microsoft philosophy, and they allow anyone to create a team, which we believe if anyone could could create a mess and sprawl and documents that live in lots of places that you don't want them to live. So we recommend restricting, especially at the beginning, who can actually create a team. So know who your power users are, and know that those folks, we would encourage them to come to our power user group sessions, because the idea is that, let's say a department manager comes to them and says, hey, I'd really like to create a team, that they're there to challenge you on, well, okay, let's understand why you're creating a team. Is what you're trying to do is team the right way to solve that problem, and let's just make sure that we have the right understanding before we start creating additional organizational structure. So the other thing that I would argue, but I would just encourage, in fact, this just came out of a conversation with a client a few weeks ago, is that, so I'm going to go illustrate the operations team again. I click on the little breadcrumbs, click on manage team, and assigning ownership. You might, to start, until your department heads, and you might validate this on a department or team lead by team lead basis, is that the owners of different teams, because of what can be done in permissioning, the owner can choose this. So you might also limit the ownership of the team to your power users to start, until you might have a department manager or a team lead that understands some of the nuances, understands some of the philosophy, so they don't start creating a mess even inside their own team, like private channels, for example. So I know we didn't cover those today, but so that's what I would recommend is, A, do not allow everyone in your organization to create a team, because you can create a total mess. B, identify power users that can have some additional training, and expect them. And I would again invite the free to come over to go to the Power User Group sessions, because the goal is to teach those folks how to have those conversations and understand how the stuff works, so they can kind of be an internal resource for you and your team leads. And then finally, maybe as a recommendation, to limit ownership of teams to those power users until you feel comfortable that your department heads, or you can assign ownership to somebody else on the team, like if I was the department manager of the operations team, for example, assign that to me, because you've vetted that, or the power user has vetted that I know how to navigate this stuff, and I understand some of the consequences of the actions that I might be able to take as a team owner. So kind of 3 different levels there, but that is my best recommendation as far as how to mitigate the sprawl that could exist if anyone in your organization could create a team. I think that is the nature of the question.
Yep, thanks, Nate. And it looks like we don't have any further questions today.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for attending. Hope this was valuable. Again, raise your hand if there's anything you think we can help you think through this process. We also we record these. They're on our YouTube channel and playlists. If you want to subscribe, every time we do a new recording, it's going to be posted there if you want to get notified, speaking of notifications. But otherwise, I really appreciate your time and attendance, and just your involvement today. And we'll sign off for today and look forward to that email as a follow-up. Talk to you soon.